In this week, we're going to take up the issue of when ignorance is good or bad for us. In IGNO 101X, that was a theme in the last lecture of the course. We also saw this issue raised numerous times throughout IGNO 101X. We found that ignorance can be both good and bad for individuals, and we also saw that ignorance underpins some important forms of social capital. During this week, we're going to pursue that idea further by posing the question of when ignorance is good or bad for society. We'll start by revisiting the question of whether ignorance is a public problem, which is the focus of this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll have a quick review of ignorance, that is IGNO 101X, the course that precedes this one. After that, we'll investigate some of the social and political functions of ignorance, for example in communication, privacy, and censorship. In the last part of the week, we'll focus on the roles that ignorance plays in shaping our orientations toward the future. That material will form the basis for learning more about how to deal with ignorance. In IGNO 101X, in the third week, we had a lecture that posed the question, is ignorance a public problem? There we examined debates over whether there is an agreed upon set of things that everyone should know, whether ignorance is increasing or decreasing, and whether hyper-specialization is depriving us of possessing a big picture by which to make sense of the world. Now, let's revisit the issue of ignorance as a public problem from a different standpoint. Instead of focusing on the individual, we're going to examine this issue at the social level. Put simply, instead of asking when ignorance is good or bad for society, it's more productive to ask what kinds of ignorance are good or bad for particular kinds of society, culture, or social arrangements. State secrecy may weaken a participatory democracy, but it can strengthen a dictatorship. Privacy may be compatible with an individualistic culture, but inimical to a collectivist one. Ignorance about groups to which you don't belong may be viewed as dysfunctional in an egalitarian society, but viewed favorably in caste or class-based social orders. Vagueness or ambiguity in communication may be helpful for polite conversation during a family reunion, but debilitating in the discussion of technical details between engineers collaborating on a project. Let's focus on a very common case in point, a kind of ignorance that commonly is called rational ignorance, a term Anthony Downs coined in his book, An Economic Theory of Democracy. Many people fail to acquire the kind of political knowledge that would enable them to knowledgeably participate in a democracy through voting, lobbying, and related efforts. However, it would be irrational for them to invest time and effort in gaining such knowledge because other investments will yield more immediate and substantial benefits. Truly rational ignorance, in fact, usually entails decisions about what to ignore. Rational ignorance fits well with and facilitates organized, networked specialization. In IGNO 101X, we saw that specialization not only eliminates the impossible requirement to know everything, it also spreads the risks and burdens of both ignorance and knowledge. In a society whose operation depends on specialized knowledge and coordinated divisions of labor, rational ignorance is a key to its sustainability. However, as Ilya Somin points out in his chapter in the Handbook of Ignorance Studies, rational ignorance can lead to harmful collective outcomes in democratic states. Majorities of voters, often ignorant of basic matters such as the structure of government budget, nature of opposing liberal and conservative ideologies, and the roles, responsibilities, and duties of government officials. The outcome of the polls, then, can be suboptimal electoral choices by voters. Ignorance that is good for the individual voter may not be good for the democratic collective. So now it's easy to see that a democratic society that also depends on specialization has a conflict of interest and logic regarding rational ignorance. The logic of specialization concludes that rational ignorance is beneficial or even essential for the effective operation of the social order. The logic of participatory democracy concludes that rational ignorance results in ineffective democratic governments and therefore undermines the social order. An interesting way to address the question of ignorance as a public problem is to turn it on its head and ask when transparency, making all information available to everyone, is viewed as good or bad for society. A policy paper by Frank Bannister and Regina Connolly asked whether transparency is an unalloyed good in e-government. As the authors point out, the advent of WikiLeaks has brought the issue of e-transparency into the domain of public debate. Broadly, e-transparency in government refers to the access to data, process, decisions, actions of governments mediated by information communications technology, or ICT. Debates about the extent to which governments can or should be transparent have a lengthy history. The prospect of e-transparency adds considerations of affordability and potential breadth of citizen response and participation. Bannister and Connolly begin their discussion by setting aside the most common objections to transparency: clear requirements for national security and commercial confidentiality in the service of protecting citizenry or other national interests. What other reasonable objections to transparency, let alone e-transparency, might there be? Traditional arguments for transparency in government are predicated on three values assertions. First, the public has a right to know. Elected office holders and appointed public or civil servants alike are accountable to their constituencies. Accountability is impossible without transparency, therefore good government requires transparency. Second, good government requires building trust between the governors and the governed, which can only arise if the governors are accountable to the governed. Third, effective citizen participation in a democracy is possible only if the citizenry is sufficiently educated and informed to make good decisions. Education and information both entail transparency. Note that the first of these arguments is a claim to a right, whereas the second and third are claims about consequences. This distinction is important. A right is, by definition, non-negotiable and, in principle, inalienable. Arguments for good consequences, on the other hand, are utilitarian instead of deontological. Utilitarian arguments can be countered by greater good arguments, and therefore are negotiable. Japanese official pronouncements about the state of the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster were expected to be more or less instantaneous and accurate. Even commentary from sources such as the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists admitted that official reports should have been forthcoming sooner about the magnitude and scope of the disaster. The gist of this commentary was that transparency would pay off better than secrecy, and the primary payoff would be increased trust in the Japanese government. However, there are counter-arguments to the belief that transparency is a necessary or even contributing factor in building trust in government. A study by Stefan Gimmelukisen in 2010 suggested that when the minutes of local council deliberations were made available, online citizens' evaluations of council competence were lower than citizens who did not have access to that information. If transparency reveals incompetency, then it may not increase trust after all. This finding is congruent with the claim that total accountability culture often also is a blame culture. There's another more subtle issue, namely that an insistence on accountability and the surveillance levels required thereby are incompatible with trust relations. People who trust one another don't place each other under 24/7 surveillance, nor do they hold them accountable for every action or decision. Trust may be built up via surveillance and accountability, but once it's been established, then the social norms around trust relations sit somewhat awkwardly alongside norms regarding transparency. The latter are more compatible with contractual relations than trust relations. Then there are the costs and risks of disclosure, which these days include exposure to litigation and the potential for data to be hacked. E-transparency is said to cost considerably less than traditional transparency and can deliver much greater volumes of data. Nevertheless, Bannister and Connolly caution that some cost increases can occur as well. Formalization, recording, and editing of what previously were informal and unrecorded processes or events can be costly, and so can the maintenance and updating of databases. Even if the lower cost argument is true, lower cost and increased capabilities also bring new problems and risk. Chief among these, according to Bannister and Connolly, are misinterpretation and misuse of data, and inadvertent enablement of misuses. On the one hand, ICT has provided the public with tools to process and analyze information that were unavailable to the radio and TV generations. On the other hand, data seldom speak for themselves, and what they can be made to say depends crucially on how they are selected and analyzed. Here's another anti-transparency argument not considered by Bannister and Connolly, grounded in a solid democratic tradition: the secret ballot. Secret ballots stifle vote buying because the buyer cannot be sure of whom their target voted for. This argument has been extended to defend secrecy regarding campaign contributions. Anonymous donations deter influence peddling, so the argument runs, because candidates can't be sure the supposed contributors actually contributed. Finally, there's a transparency bugbear known to any wise manager who's tried to implement systems to make their underlings accountable: gaming the system. Critics of school league tables claim that they motivate teachers to tailor curricula to the tests or even indulge in outright cheating. And you can find gaming in any competitive market. Elliot Van Brunskerk posted an intriguing piece on how marketers are gaming social media in terms of artificially inflated metrics such as numbers or friends of YouTube views. In my 1989 book, I pointed out that information has come to resemble hard currency and that the information society is also an increasingly regulated, litigious society. This combination motivates those under surveillance, evaluation, or accountability regimes to distort or simply omit potentially discrediting information. Bannister and Connolly point to the emergence of a non-recording culture in public service, where public servants are concerned about the impact of data release. One solution is not to create or record the data in the first place. To paraphrase the conclusion I came to in 1989, the new dilemma is that the control strategies designed to enhance transparency may actually increase intentional opacity. I should close that by mentioning that in general I favor transparency, but I also recognize that it has its price. The next lecture will review some of the main points raised in IGNO 101X. That lecture actually is an edited video of a talk that I gave at the first global conference on research, implementation, and integration in September 2013.